The groom tried to kick the mafia boss's autistic son out of the wedding until she claimed the boy was the only reason she said yes. The heavy scent of white lilies, which hours ago had seemed like the height of elegance, now felt like the air in a tomb. Michael's hand remained clamped on my elbow, his fingers digging into my skin with a force that promised a dark reckoning once the doors were closed. "Get that defective brat out of my sight," he hissed again, his voice a low vibration of venom that rippled through the silent ballroom. The guests, a sea of silk and tailored wool, held their collective breath, their eyes darting between my furious groom and the small boy trembling at my feet. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. John didn't cry. Instead, he made a low, rhythmic humming sound, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears to drown out the shattering glass and the jagged edges of Michael's temper. I looked toward the front row, where Alexander Volkov sat. He hadn't moved, but the air around him had curdled into something lethal. His eyes, dark as a winter sea, were fixed on Michael's throat. I felt the last thread of my endurance snap. The financial ruin of my family, the debt Michael had used to chain me to this altar, none of it mattered as much as the terrified child who had no one to stand for him. With a sudden wrench, I pulled my arm free from Michael's grasp. The sound of my silk gown rustling was like a thunderclap in the stillness as I knelt on the cold, polished floor. "Hannah, get up this instant," Michael barked, his face twisting into a mask of humiliated rage. I ignored him, reaching out to John. I didn't touch him. I knew he couldn't handle the contact yet, but I placed myself between him and the man I was supposed to call my husband. "It's okay, John," I whispered, my voice steady for the first time all day. "The noise is stopping now. Look at the patterns on my lace. Can you count the flowers?" John's humming slowed. His deep brown eyes, so like his father's, flickered toward my sleeve. "You are making a spectacle of yourself," Michael sneered, stepping toward us. "You said yes to me, Hannah. You belong to this family now." I stood up slowly, my white veil trailing like a shroud behind me. I looked Michael dead in the eye, letting the elite of Harbor City see the utter lack of fear in my gaze. "I did say yes," I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "But don't flatter yourself, Michael. I didn't say it for your money or your name. I said it because Alexander promised me I could be near John. This boy is the only reason I stood at this altar today." The scandalized gasp from the crowd was a physical wave. I felt Volkov's gaze shift from Michael to me, no longer a predator looking at prey, but a man seeing a miracle. I reached down, took John's hand, and walked away from the altar, leaving my marriage dead on the floor. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite slammed shut with a finality that made the crystal perfume bottles on the vanity rattle. I hadn't even had the chance to unlace the bodice of my gown before Michael was on me, his face a distorted mask of crimson fury. The perfection of his high society wedding had been dragged through the mud, and I could see the calculated cruelty in his eyes as he unbuckled his leather belt with a slow, trembling deliberation. "You think because the city fears Volkov you're untouchable?" He spat, his voice a jagged edge of the man I had mistakenly agreed to marry. "You are my property, Hannah. I bought your father's debt, and I bought you. You will learn the price of humiliating me." I backed away until the cold glass of the window pressed against my spine, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silk of my dress, once a symbol of my family's salvation, now felt like a shroud. Just as Michael raised his hand, the air in the room didn't just change, it died. A thunderous crash echoed from downstairs, the sound of the front door being forced off its hinges with a violent, surgical precision. Michael froze, his head whipping toward the hallway. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the crash. It was the silence of a predator who didn't need to shout to be heard. Then came the footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and echoing with the authority of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. The bedroom door didn't open. It was simply filled. Alexander Volkov stood in the frame, his charcoal overcoat still dusted with the night's mist, his presence turning the luxurious room into a cramped cell. His dark eyes didn't even flicker toward the belt in Michael's hand. They landed on me, scanning for damage with the intensity of a searchlight. "I believe our business concluded at the altar, Michael," Alexander said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that made the floorboards vibrate. "This is a private residence, Volkov. You can't just—" Michael's bravado cracked, his voice rising into a panicked thinness. Alexander took a single step into the room. The two men behind him, shadows in dark suits, moved with the synchronized grace of a firing squad. "I am not here for business," Alexander stated, his gaze finally settling on Michael with a coldness that seemed to drop the room's temperature. "I am here because my son asked why his friend was crying, and I find I dislike having to explain the cruelty of small men to him." He looked back at me, extending a gloved hand. "Hannah, your things are already in the car." The heavy oak doors of the study clicked shut with a finality that made Hannah's pulse stutter. Alexander didn't sit. He paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long and thin across the Persian rug. The silence between them was thick, charged with the kind of atmospheric pressure that precedes a devastating storm. When he finally turned to face her, his expression wasn't one of anger, but of a cold, calculated victory that chilled her more than any outburst could have. He tossed a thick leather portfolio onto the mahogany desk. The gold leaf on the cover caught the light, and Hannah's heart sank as she recognized the logo of her father's firm. With a flick of his wrist, Alexander opened the folder to a signature page. He explained, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy, that Michael's mounting debts hadn't merely been settled by a third party, they had been bought. Every outstanding loan, every leveraged asset, and the very deed to the family company now resided in Alexander's hands. The air felt thin as Hannah realized the extent of the trap. Her father hadn't just been saved, he had been acquired. But Alexander wasn't finished. He slid a second document across the polished surface toward her. It was a personal services contract, drafted with a clinical precision that made her skin crawl. In exchange for the total absolution of the family's debt and the continued operation of the company, Hannah was to be the collateral. The terms were non-negotiable. She was required to move into the Blackwood estate immediately, assuming full responsibility for John's daily care and recovery. It was a debt of honor, Alexander claimed, though the way his eyes searched hers suggested something far more complex than simple restitution. He spoke of the arrangement as a logistical necessity, a way for her to pay back what her family owed through labor and proximity. Hannah looked down at the paper, the ink blurring as the reality of her new life took shape. She was no longer a guest or a family friend. She was a fixture of the estate, bound by a legal and moral tether to the very man who looked at her with such haunting intensity. She felt the weight of the Blackwood legacy closing in around her, a gilded cage built of old money and new secrets. Without a word, she reached for the pen, knowing that by signing, she was surrendering her ghost of a future to pay for her father's past. The Volkov mansion did not welcome Hannah so much as it swallowed her. The foyer was a cathedral of cold marble and echoing silence, a sharp contrast to the chaotic warmth of the home she had been forced to leave behind. Alexander had retreated into the shadows of his own business dealings, leaving her to navigate this new world alone. Her first task lay at the end of the north wing, behind a door painted a deep, matte navy. When she stepped into John's room, she found him sitting on a low ottoman, his back to the door. He didn't turn. The boy was a study in stillness, his gaze fixed on a series of wooden blocks he had arranged across the floor. They weren't stacked into towers. They were laid out in a complex, repeating geometric spiral that snaked toward the window. Hannah stayed by the threshold, sensing that a single misplaced step into his visual field would be an intrusion he couldn't tolerate. The silence was brittle, but she didn't try to break it with hollow words. Instead, she sat on the floor several feet away and watched the pattern. She noticed a gap in the sequence, a missing blue prism, where the logic of the spiral demanded one. Reaching slowly into the velvet bag of spares nearby, she slid a blue block across the floor. It stopped just short of his hand. John stiffened, his small fingers hovering, before he tentatively reached out and clicked the piece into place. It was the first bridge built between them, silent and fragile. As the afternoon light faded, Hannah reached for her cello case, which had been delivered earlier that morning. She didn't look at him as she tightened the bow. She began with a simple Bach suite, the notes low and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. At first, John's shoulders remained tight, his focus locked on his blocks. But as the mathematics of the music took hold, the predictable intervals and the steady, grounding rhythm, his posture softened. By the time she reached the final movement, the boy had shifted. He wasn't looking at her yet, but he had tilted his head toward the sound, his fingers tapping a rhythmic counterpoint against his knee. In the structured world of the Volkovs, where everything was leverage and debt, Hannah realized that music was the only language that didn't demand something in return. For a brief moment, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a stage, and she saw the first flicker of a soul behind the silent prince's eyes. The shift in the room was subtle at first, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. Hannah didn't need to turn around to know that Alexander was standing in the doorway. He had become a recurring shadow during her afternoon sessions with John, a silent sentinel who watched from the periphery of the light. For days, he simply observed how she navigated the boy's world, noting the way she used the cello's vibrato to soothe John's sensory overloads, or how she used a deck of cards to teach him the Fibonacci sequence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and turned the room into a study of amber and ink, John finally drifted into a rare, peaceful sleep on the rug. Hannah set her bow down, the silence of the mansion rushing back in to fill the void left by the music. Alexander moved then, stepping into the room with none of his usual predatory grace. He looked tired, the sharp lines of his suit softened by the dimness, and for the first time, the mask of the ruthless creditor seemed to slip. He sat in the chair opposite her, his eyes fixed on his son. He spoke softly, his voice a low rasp that felt more intimate than any threat he had ever leveled against her. He told her about Elena, John's mother, and how she had been the one who understood the boy's silences before the world broke her. He admitted that since her death, the mansion had become a mausoleum of things unsaid. Alexander confessed that he saw his own coldness reflected in John's isolation, a terrifying hereditary trait he didn't know how to break. The fear in his voice was a revelation. It wasn't the fear of a man losing a business empire, but the raw, jagged terror of a father who realized he was a stranger to his own child. He looked at Hannah then, not as a piece of collateral, but as a lifeline. He admitted that he had bought her family's debt out of a desperate, selfish hope that her light could penetrate the darkness he had allowed to settle over the Volkov name. In that vulnerable moment, the power dynamic shifted. The man who owned everything was admitting he possessed nothing of value without the boy's love. Hannah realized that the contract was more than a financial arrangement. It was an invitation into the wreckage of a family. As Alexander stood to leave, lingering for a moment as if wanting to say more, the air between them vibrated with a new, dangerous understanding. She was no longer just a caregiver. She was the keeper of the secrets that lived in the shadows of the Volkov heart. The charity gala was a sea of shimmering silk and cutting whispers. A gilded cage expanded to the size of a ballroom. Hannah felt the weight of the Volkov diamonds against her collarbone, a heavy reminder of the brand she now wore. Alexander remained a constant, grounding presence at her side, his hand resting possessively in the small of her back as they navigated the elite circles of the city. John sat between them, his small tuxedo a miniature reflection of his father's, clutching a small, multifaceted crystal star in his pocket, a stress star Hannah had given him to ground himself when the world became too loud. The evening fractured when she spotted Michael. Her father looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot and frantic as he cornered her near a bank of white hydrangeas while Alexander was pulled away by a board member. Michael didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he gripped her forearm with a desperation that bordered on violence. He hissed a demand for insider information, a way to claw back the company he had gambled away, threatening that if she didn't help him, he would ensure the world knew she had sold herself to the Volkovs. The smell of scotch and failure rolled off him, and for a moment, Hannah was back in the house of her childhood, paralyzed by his volatility. Beside her, John stiffened. He didn't scream or retreat into himself as he once would have. He watched the way Michael's fingers dug into Hannah's skin, his young mind processing the breach of the patterns they had spent weeks building. With a deliberate, steady movement, John pulled the crystal star from his pocket and held it high, the facets catching the overhead chandeliers and refracting a sharp, rhythmic pulse of light across the room. It was the signal they had practiced a silent cry for help that bypassed the need for words. Within seconds, the air changed. Two of Alexander's security detail appeared from the shadows, their presence silent and immovable. Alexander followed close behind, his expression transforming into something predatory and ancient. He didn't need to say a word. The mere sight of his son protecting the woman who had become their shared center was enough to freeze Michael in his tracks. The guards led her father away as he sputtered uselessly, but Hannah's attention was fixed on John. The boy hadn't looked away, his hand still gripping the star, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound clarity. He had found his voice not in a sound, but in an action, proving that the silk of their connection was far stronger than the threads of the debt that had brought her there. The aftermath of the gala left a lingering chill in the corridors of the Volkov estate, a reminder that even the most beautiful facades could hide rot. Hannah found herself unable to sleep. the memory of her father's desperate grip still burning on her skin. Seeking the solace of the library, she moved through the dim halls like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the heavy carpets. It was there, near the mahogany desk, where her life had been signed away, that she saw the faint glow of a tablet screen left active in the shadows. A series of encrypted messages sat open correspondence she recognized instantly by the frantic, misspelled syntax of the sender. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scrolled through the logs. Michael hadn't stopped at threats. Driven by the crushing weight of gambling debts that Alexander's mercy hadn't covered, her father was bartering the only thing he had left: his knowledge of the estate's vulnerabilities. He was leaking the rotation schedules of the guards and the digital bypass codes for the North Wing, the very wing where John slept. The recipient was a name that made her breath hitch. The Romanovs, a rival syndicate whose history with the Volkovs was written in blood and ash. To Michael, these codes were just numbers, a way to clear the ledger and return to his life of leisure. To Hannah, they were a death warrant for the boy who had just begun to trust her. She realized with a sickening clarity that her father hadn't just lost his company. He had lost his humanity, willing to trade the safety of a child for a clean slate. The betrayal tasted like copper in her mouth. She stood in the center of the room, the digital evidence glowing like a hot coal in her hands. She knew the rules of Alexander's world. Treason was a debt that could only be paid in one currency. If she went to him with this, she was signing her father's execution. If she stayed silent, she was complicit in whatever violence was coming for the Volkovs. She looked toward the stairs leading to John's room, thinking of the stress star and the fragile bridge they had built. The debt of honor she owed was no longer to the man who sired her, but to the house that had, in its own cold way, given her a purpose. As a floorboard creaked behind her, Hannah realized she was no longer alone in the library. The shadow of the Volkov legacy was lengthening, and the price of the truth was about to be collected. The scream of the estate's security sirens was not a high-pitched wail, but a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the marrow of Hannah's bones. The lights flickered and died, plunged into the crimson emergency glow that turned the familiar corridors into a fractured nightmare. She didn't wait for the guards. She didn't wait for Alexander. She ran for the North Wing, her lungs burning, the sound of shattered glass and distant, muffled gunshots echoing from the lower floors. The breach was here, and the codes her father had sold had opened the gates wide. When she burst into John's room, the boy was huddled in the center of his bed, his hands pressed hard against his ears, his body shaking with the onset of a catastrophic sensory storm. The world was breaking around him, and the patterns were gone. Hannah didn't waste time with explanations. She scooped him up, feeling his small heart hammering like a trapped bird against her chest, and carried him toward the back of his walk-in closet. She pressed a hidden latch behind a row of coats, revealing the safe harbor they had spent the last week designing together. It was a small, soundproofed chamber lined with heavy acoustic foam and soft, tactile fabrics, a place intended for his meltdowns, now repurposed for his survival. As she pulled the heavy, reinforced door shut, the chaos of the mansion vanished into a pressurized silence. Outside, the battle for the Volkov legacy was being fought with steel and lead, but inside, the air was still and smelled of lavender. John began to rock, his eyes wide and vacant. Hannah knew that if he spiraled now, his panic could be as dangerous as the men outside. She reached for a basket of smooth river stones they had collected and began to hum the Bach suite from their first session. One by one, she placed the stones in a circle on the floor, inviting him into the ritual. Slowly, the boy's hands lowered. He reached for a stone, his fingers tracing its cool, polished surface, anchoring himself to the small, controlled world Hannah had built for him. Beyond the thick walls, the floorboards groaned under the weight of heavy boots, and the muffled vibration of an explosion rocked the house. Hannah gripped the edge of the carpet, her knuckles white, but she kept her voice steady, weaving a protective web of melody around the boy. She was the shield, the music was the armor, and the secret room remained an island of order in a sea of encroaching violence. In the dark, she realized she was no longer paying a debt. She was fighting for the only home she had left. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the gunfire had ever been. When the door to the safe harbor finally creaked open, it wasn't a mercenary who stood there, but Alexander. He was disheveled, a streak of soot across his high cheekbone and his coat discarded, but his eyes were fixed solely on the boy sitting in the center of the room. Seeing John calm, still tracing the circle of stones Hannah had laid out, Alexander let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. The threat was gone. Michael had been dealt with, his betrayal erased with the cold efficiency of a man protecting his sun and moon. Days later, the estate had been scrubbed of the siege, though a new, solemn stillness pervaded the halls. Alexander found Hannah in the music room. Her cello leaned against the window where the afternoon light pooled like spilled honey. He didn't approach her with the looming authority of a creditor. Instead, he placed a single envelope on the piano bench. It contained a settlement, a sum large enough to ensure she would never have to answer to a man like her father again, or even to him. It was the return of her freedom, the formal dissolution of the contract that had bound her as collateral. He told her the car was ready, and the debt was considered paid in blood and loyalty. But then he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor where John's wooden blocks were neatly arranged in a new, complex spiral. He admitted, in a voice roughened by uncharacteristic hesitation, that while the debt was gone, the need remained. He offered her a second choice, to stay, not as a captive or a servant of the Volkov ledger, but as a permanent anchor in a house that had forgotten how to drift. Hannah looked at the envelope and then at the door, where John stood watching them, his stress star gripped loosely in his hand. For the first time in her life, the path leading away felt like the one leading into the dark. With her father, she had been a bargaining chip. In the social circles of her past, she had been a decorative ghost. But here, in the wreckage of a broken dynasty, she was the architect of a child's peace, and the only person who could make a man like Alexander Volkov look vulnerable. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she picked up her bow, the resin catching the light. She realized that home wasn't a place where one was safe from the world, but a place where one was finally, undeniably visible. She looked at Alexander and then at the boy, and for the first time, she gave the only answer that wasn't a negotiation. She was staying.